Morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to have a panel for advisory services today. So to kick things off, I just want to ask the panelists, what are advisory services in this segment, in business aviation, and what do they entail?
So advisory services are extremely broad. It can be everything from financial advice to structural advice, legal advice, jurisdictional advice, purchasing advice. The list goes on and on and on. So it is a very, very broad topic. And I guess what the panel up here is speaking about today is how to navigate through some of those issues and how to make best use of the advice that you may need in your either transaction or your management of the aircraft that you're dealing with.
All right. From my side, Jaslyn, basically the objective of advisory services to help the customers making the right decisions, providing with the right informations, credible informations, and reliable informations. And then, yeah, David just mentioned on point, the aspect is very broad. Basically, from my perspective, is basically to provide the right aircraft costing, make sure the aircraft is well, the customers well informed, and then basically getting through the whole process of the aircraft itself.
Scott?
Yes, and from my perspective is more from a legal kind of closing the transaction view. I think it's important for people to realize that advisory services are not a one-stop shop. You have to have a team of advisors, and you have to put together the right team of advisors, and that team can and will change depending on the transaction. So you may have a certain team of advisors that are good at closing deals that are in the U.S., or you may have a different team of advisors that are good at closing transactions that are international, cross-border type of deals. I also find that I think the most important advisor to start the whole thing off is the broker. The broker normally has, a great deal of contact with the owner. They're normally very influential with the owner. They set expectations on when you might close and when things should close, and so they set the whole tone for the transaction. And I see that if we have a transaction where the parties have engaged good, reputable, knowledgeable, agreeable brokers, then it's a great start. If they've hired somebody who's not as knowledgeable or they don't really know what they're doing, then it can be a big problem. I mean, for instance, if you hire a broker that closes transactions all the time in Wichita, Kansas, but yet you're buying a 7X that's coming out of Asia and going onto the U.S. registry, that's probably not the right broker for that deal. So I think it's important to identify the right advisors, the right team early in a transaction.
Thank you. So I think in Asia Pacific region, there are a lot of well-established management companies, right? And I think majority of these companies will feel like they are already providing these services. So why do you think owners still need to seek external, advisory services perhaps from David?
I think that management companies do have a capacity to give some advice. But as we've just stated, everybody cannot be an expert in every aspect of advice. So in the realm that I do a lot of work in, which is in appraisal and inspection services, a management company is not necessarily going to know the ins and outs of how an appraisal needs to work for the banking community or the legal community. So I think that even though management companies are very capable, there's two issues. One, that they may not be knowledgeable in the specific area of advice that's required. And secondly, they may be conflicted. They may have an actual bias in the project and not necessarily be able to give advice that is independent and unbiased.
All right, Jaslyn, I came from the, I would say, a big management company. And in my experience itself, they still need advisory services. I mean, like a long list of the aircraft and into services, and then sometimes they engage with us. Let's say they have customers who wants to buy a certain type of aircraft which they don't have it before, and then they came to us. They reach advisory services to find out what's the costing actually, because they may not have the database of the cost itself. And then again, the market is a mix between a big, small operator and a flight department as well. And in many cases, in my JSSI role, back in Indonesia, a small departments, a small individual owners, PA, they came to us getting advice from the aircraft costings, choosing the right registration, so-called like that. So I guess, the big management company, they sometimes still need advisory services. And then on top of that as well, we are tools for the small and flight departments in the region as well. That's about it.
Thank you. Scott, and you're based in the US as well, and then we see there are a lot of in-house legal counsels available, like services available at management companies. So where do you come into the picture then?
Well, I think on most of the transactions that we see that run smoothly anyway, you're looking at a team of advisors. Most of the time on U.S. deals, you don't have to convince people of this. They normally have, the buyer has a broker, the seller has a broker, everybody has lawyers. Hopefully both sides have their own lawyers. You really can't have a lawyer that does the whole deal for everyone. It's unethical, and it's hard to structure a transaction that way. You have to have tax advisors. Sometimes the guy that's structuring the deal or the lawyer that's structuring the deal, they don't have the relevant tax expertise to address closing locations, and you have to have customs expertise. A lot of people don't realize, you have to clear customs in a certain way, coming in or out of the certain jurisdiction. And so there's a whole team of advisors that you have to put together, and I find that on U.S. deals or any transaction, it's extremely important to have someone that's actually running the deal too. So you need a checklist, and you need to clearly define the roles of each of the advisors involved, because if you don't, you're going to get to closing and realize, as Oliver said, you don't have the original documents somewhere to cancel the aircraft from the registry, or you didn't get proper tax advice on where you're going to close. So I think that you need one advisor, hopefully, that's predominantly driving the transaction, but you also need to clearly define everyone's roles. It probably needs to be in a checklist. And you need to have, good old-fashioned conference calls. It's one thing to send around emails and tell everyone, here's your responsibility, but no one does that. You need to get people on the phone, have a conference call, make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that they understand their advisory role in the transaction.
Thank you. So are there specific examples that you can share with us where the services that you have provided to the owners in the region, how you can actually add value and perhaps save them money or prevent more risks foresee? Like David, I'm sure you have a lot of
All right. Well, basically, I have a recent experience because I'm based in Indonesia, and I had a client in Indonesia. It's a first-time jet owners. So basically, they were not so sure which aircraft they want to buy. We provide them services in terms of providing, I would say, like an aircraft costing. Not only because buying an aircraft is just not spending on the acquisition cost, but you need to know how much you will spend along the way. So basically, the aircraft owners now, he had two choices to choose on the type of aircraft. And then he wanted to know how much it costs to operate each of the aircraft itself. And then it came into one. And then from one type of aircraft, he had he had two choices of the serial number. So I would say that the one was 21 serial number, the other one was 42. And then we helped them advising, giving the reliable costing not only operating the first year of the cost itself, but we look more deeper on that because we saw the maintenance log, we saw the flight logs, and then we examined the physical of the aircraft, and then from that, the result was that we gave them, I would say, the reliable costing on each aircraft, how much it costs, and then he realized that okay, having the 42 aircraft is more costly than having a 21 fleet. So bottom line is actually the service is actually giving the owners the information for him to make the right decisions. So now we've been using the aircraft since then, and he's happy with that.
That's great. Any more stories to share?
Yeah, so maybe not a specific story, but what I see often on U.S. transactions, aircraft coming back into the United States, three things that I see that often cause the deal to either not close or at least to have to be restructured in a way. A lot of people don't realize that you can't operate an aircraft that's U.S. registered under Part 91 out of a special purpose company. So basically, if you have a company that's formed that has no business or role except to operate the aircraft or own the aircraft, there are prohibitions on that company operating the aircraft under Part 91. In theory, it's supposed to be operated under Part 135. And so that's one example of something that you need to identify whenever you're structuring the transaction, and if you don't identify that early, it can, of course, cause lots of ripple effect changes for not complying. Another for U.S. deals are that there's a citizenship requirement for registering an aircraft with the FAA, and unlike other countries, I mean, it's actually not just a objective test; it's an objective and subjective test. So you can't just form an LLC in Delaware, and then presto, you meet the citizenship requirements. I mean, the FAA looks more deeply at that, and so if we're involved with the transaction and we are involved early enough, we can help people structure around that so that they can put their aircraft on the U.S. registry. But it takes trust or maybe some changes in the way they've set up their company for that to work. Another thing that we often see on U.S. deals are people try to close transactions over international waters. So they try to avoid, tax implications by closing, not having to look in a certain jurisdiction. They say, no, we'll just fly out over international water and close the transaction. Well, if it's U.S. registered aircraft, you really can't do that because your registration's invalid. So that's just a few examples of services that we might provide that would provide assistance to parties trying to close the deal.
I think that being involved with advisory for aircraft is a little bit like Forrest Gump's box of chocolates. You just never know what you're going to get. And it's very enlightening sometimes that we might get involved in an advisory part of a project, and it turns out to be something completely different. For example, we had a banking client that we were doing some work for here in Asia Pac, and the requirement was to just put a value on the aircraft. Pretty simple, straightforward. Do some market research, here's the value. And we advised the bank that it would be beneficial to them to have an inspection as well as just the number. And what we discovered is that the client wanted to change banks, change the registration, and change where they were flying the aircraft all at the same time. And the reason they wanted to change the registration was so that they could have better access into European landing areas. And so that was all very straightforward. You think, okay, just put a value on the aircraft and away you go. Well, what we discovered throughout the process when we did the inspection was that the aircraft was registered in the FAA N registration jurisdiction, and the configuration of the cabin was not compliant if it was going to be changed to an EASA registration. And so there was literally a 7-figure sum required to reconfigure the cabin to make sure that they could comply with the change in registration. Now, we had to go back to the bank and say, well, do you want the value now with the N registration or after it's reconfigured with the cost of the reconfiguration? So it's not just a simple go to your bingo barrel and pull out a number and that's the value. You have to do a lot of research and you have to actually find the information that's required to give the client what they need. And I think that's the important bit, and we said it before this morning, is the advisory services are to ensure that the client receives the appropriate information to make their valid decisions.
Yeah, and kind of adding on to that a little bit too, I think that it's important that, again, you have the right team and that you don't engage advisors that try to do things that they're not good at. There are reasons why people are expert in tax. There are reasons why people are expert in maintenance. There are reasons why people are expert in brokering, and they're good at it. And when you have, for instance, the example of a management company trying to do everything, normally they're just not as good at it. And so you need to get the right team. You need to get people who are reputable and who have done it before. I mean, you just can't. This is kind of a tribal knowledge industry. There's not really I mean, David's writing a book, I know, but I mean, there's not really a book on how to do aircraft transactions right. A lot of it's just learned, and it's learned from experience.
Right. So how are the consultants in Asia Pac different to, let's say, the European or US market? Because I guess a lot of us do businesses in China, and it seems like almost every person that I meet, there seems to be some sort of consultant. So how is that different in the rest of the world?
I think that in different pockets of the world, there's different levels of industry and professional maturity. And so I think that in more developed markets like particularly the US and to an extent Europe, there is quite mature markets there with all the different advisory services. So the legal services and the charter services and the brokerage services seem more developed in some of those areas. So I think one thing is that there's a more mature aspect to some other jurisdictions. I think the other thing is that there are probably some cultural issues in Asia Pac that impact on how we do things. For example, because of the maturity in the different jurisdictions in the US, for example, it's more understood to go to a certain practitioner to gain the advice. Whereas because the market is less mature in Asia Pac, that advice might not be necessarily available, or it might cost more than the client anticipates. So it becomes a little bit, we can get by without that.
How about in Indonesia? How is it different?
Well, in Indonesia, I mean, from my experience, I've seen numbers of cases where one guy, a pilot, helping a customers think that they are a jet expert. They can just print a name card and setting up a business center as an address of the company, and then thinking that he could do a lot of things for them. But again, I mean, getting the trust of the owners is quite challenging as well, because reaching them is not easy. So most of the time, from my experience, that there's a PA, and then there's another a person that having a certain agenda. It's quite challenging. I mean, I know US is very much mature, and then people can access the informations, and then getting people that are very expert on is probably easier than what's in this part of the world. But yeah, in Indonesia, most of the time, but nowadays we've seen that the jet owners, the existing jet owners, when they want to upgrade, they know where to go. But the problem is when we are dealing with the first-time jet owners, sometimes they don't know where to start, and then at that point in time, a lot of opportunist people usually comes to help them and think that they can be a jet expert over Googling only. That's it.
And oh, go ahead. No, I was going to say to your point, it's not necessarily the right answer to also go to a US supplier, because they won't necessarily know, as Scott's point before, if they're only dealt with, you know, Wichita and US entities, they won't necessarily know the landscape here in Asia Pac.
Well, yes, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Scott.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, the U.S. market it's large, broad. I mean, there are more competent, reputable advisors in the market, and so I mean, that's one difference, is just the number of people who actually do know what they're doing. But you know, even with that said, it's a small knit community. I mean, pretty much one of the first things I ask if we're asked to close a transaction or escrow funds or something like that is, who are the lawyers involved? Because I know if it's David Hernandez or, you know, other lawyers that I know, well, the deal's going to be done right and my fees are going to be lower. If it's people I've never heard of, then I might double my fees. I don't know, because it's just going to take a long time, or it very well could take a long time to do the transaction. And so a lot of it is, again, it's using people that know what they're doing, that have done it before. And the one thing I have found kind of in the, you know, helping clients in the Asian market is you have to get to know people. I mean, it takes a while to earn someone's trust. It takes a while to, it's why we come over here, you know, to talk to people, and they have to get to know you before they're going to trust you on certain advisory, in certain advisory situations. So you just have to spend the time and the effort to be involved in events like this and to get to know the clients.
Thank you. I see we have a question from the audience. So how does a customer truly get unbiased advice when a third-party advisor plays so many roles and businesses in the transaction? Anyone?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. The short answer is it's very difficult, and the reason it is because of the points we were just making before about building up trust. And as a more mature market has built up more trust, and in Asia Pac there's a lot more trust that needs to be built with advisors that are knowledgeable. And I think the issue is that we're often asked about projects in the region, and they say, oh look, don't worry, we just want some of your thoughts on an email, because we're going to engage someone that's local that doesn't have an airfare involved. It's like, okay, good luck with that. That'd be great, because the person that they're going to involve, or the entity that they're going to involve, is got one of two issues that we usually find. They're either involved in the activity which it compromises their unbiased opinion and compromises their objectivity, or they're not necessarily appropriately qualified to pass opinion on the issue that they're being asked about. So, and we find in the region that it's either someone that is not qualified but is a friend of a friend and is able to do a good email that gives you the answer that you need, or is someone that is involved in the deal and not necessarily able to be independent. So that's the two areas that we see. And sometimes that's why folk like us are involved with a transaction, is because we're not involved. You know, we deliberately don't have anything to do with maintenance, anything to do with management, anything to do with brokerage. The only thing we do is have input on appraisal and inspection and advisory. We don't broker or anything like that. And I guess as a group of people that are involved in advisory services, it's important to say, I have a conflict with that, I can't give you unbiased advice.
All right. From my side, basically, I'm just being honest with the customers. Probably, like, for example, like, hey, this is our expertise, so I cannot do the whole thing. Let's say if you want to know the right costing of the operating an aircraft, I can do that. And then, but if let's say if you ask me about the tax advice, I can help you, connect you with the right person. So just being honest with them, and I'm not an expert at everything.
Yeah, it was kind of the point earlier. I mean, you really need your own broker. A buyer needs their broker, the seller needs their broker. Everyone needs their own lawyer. You know, the buyer needs a lawyer, the seller needs a lawyer, a management company might need a lawyer. You need to hire independent advisors in certain key areas to avoid the issue that the question's addressing.
Great. I think there's another question from the audience. What is the most common advice or transaction you've been asked to consult in Asia Pac?
Let me start. All right. This is in Southeast Asia, well, specifically Indonesia. Usually, after they know what they want to, well, which aircraft they want to buy, usually it's about aircraft registrations, whether which jurisdiction, and other than that, should I go Part 91 or 135, and yeah, about tax. That's most likely that I'm dealing with.
Right. Scott?
Yeah, our involvement normally is, you know, if the parties want to put the aircraft on the U.S. registry, we're advising on how to do that and how to structure the registration and maybe the operation of the aircraft. And if you're coming off the U.S. registry, we're involved with the escrow and the closing and advising on the mechanics of getting that getting that transaction done.
Thank you.
Being involved with the appraisal side of things, we often get asked to comment about not only what we saw when we were gathering the information for the appraisal, but it's also about the ancillary issues around it. And so some of our clients will ask, so what was the maintenance company like that's doing the maintenance? And the management company, what were the records like? What were their offices like? And the people that you came across, were they helpful? Did they know what they were talking about? And so the information that we gather while we're doing our appraisal information gathering is often the subject of some of the questions that the clients ask for. And it's more around, if you boil all those questions down, can I have confidence in the people that are looking after that aircraft? That's essentially what they're asking. Is my investment in that aircraft going to be okay in the region? I've heard stories. I want to know, when you were in front of that aircraft, are those stories true? And that's the kind of things that clients are asking about, is what's actually going on in the region? What can you see when you're there? And so, you know, we need to help them understand that. And sometimes our brief will not only be to investigate the aircraft, but do some investigation around the management company, do some investigation about what kind of maintenance has gone on, how are the records, where are the records kept, are they in a box in the back of a broom cupboard, or are they in a fireproof safe? You know, there's a whole lot of information that people actually want to know about because they're not in front of the aircraft, they don't see it.
Okay, we have an interesting question from the audience. Management companies cannot do everything, and this is why you always need to recommend the use of a reputable international management companies. Do you agree? Scott, would you have any insight?
Well, absolutely, it's critical that you have a competent management company, and I don't know if the question is getting at, you know, at international management companies that operate in multiple jurisdictions, if that's what the question is asking, but the parties need to do their due diligence, and you can get a lot of input from the brokers are helpful in identifying good management companies. It's probably not something I, as a lawyer, would offer an opinion on. I mean, we would look at their contracts, but that's not legal advice necessarily. It's more practical advice.
Right.
All right. I would say that the most important thing, not only it's not always international management company. It's about a level of trust of a management company that you put in your aircraft. I mean, like, it can be a local company in Singapore, it could be in Indonesia. As long as you're comfortable with them, I think that's the most important thing.
So local knowledge always helps as well.
Exactly, yeah.
David?
And I also think it's about it's about recognizing what you don't know. If you don't have the knowledge, don't give the advice. I mean, in terms of a story, we've got a file that we're working on at the moment. The aircraft was registered in one jurisdiction. It was moved to another country and wanted to be registered in that jurisdiction. So they deregistered it from the original country. And during that time, they needed to change the engines because they were time expired. So they're changing the engines out. Now the aircraft is not airworthy. They're doing all that work. At the same time, we've just been approached by a liquidation management company because the new owner has spent all this money and has gone bankrupt. And now they're trying to work out how to sell the aircraft with no registration, no maintenance completed, and no engines. And it's like, oh yeah, that's easy. We can help you with that. And so we've had to guide them to talk to registration authorities to work out how to most easily get through that, and to legal advice into how to work through that, and to an administration accountant to deal with the liquidation issues. So I know for a fact that I don't have the information for some of those issues that they're raising, but I do know that I can say the aircraft is worth X because of these issues.
Right, and if from a legal advisory capacity, you know, of course, we would have never advised the client not to have the aircraft on a registry.
Right.
It's like that was the first misstep. It's just taking it off and not putting it immediately on another registry and knowing that in advance.
Yeah. Oh, and the country that they've moved it to doesn't have any of that aircraft type, so you know it just gets thicker and deeper. The box of chocolates gets tastier.
So is there any market trend in the advisory services space that you see?
You know, I think that people have an appreciation for the complexity of the aircraft transaction and all these things that are going on, but there's a lot of pressure on pricing. So as far as the services go, so no one wants to pay for their own lawyer. No one wants to pay for the right technical advisors at times, and so they do try to go to someone who you know would say it's a one-stop shop to do all of these things. So I think that's a trend.
Well, for the existing aircraft operator, basically probably one thing they look at now is actually the more efficient process of entering into services, getting the aircraft delivered and operating in a more efficient way. I think that's what I'm looking at.
And I think the trend, which is a rightful trend, is to have a qualified and designated professional that is advising you. You know, if you want legal advice, go to a lawyer. If you want tax advice, go to either a tax lawyer or a tax accountant. If you want an appraisal, get an appraisal that's done by an accredited appraiser that is recognized by an appraising entity. It's important to make sure that the professional that you're engaging is actually someone that is qualified and capable of doing what you're asking.
Thank you. I think we're almost out of time, so do we have last-minute questions?
Any questions from the audience? If not, then thank you so much. That was great. Thank you.